Hi, everyone. All right, it's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host. Remember, I am the publisher of this Skeptic magazine, quarterly publication of the Skeptic Society. We are a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization devoted to investigating claims of the paranormal, pseudoscience, fringe groups, and cults of all claims of all kinds. And if you want to support the show and the magazine, you can just go to skeptic.com/donate if you want to make a tax-deductible donation, or you can order the magazine there, or you could just walk into your local bookstore where you are likely to find our magazine still in print. This particular issue from 1 year ago was on race, particularly appropriate as my guest today is Ed Larson, the author of many acclaimed works in American history, including the Pulitzer Prize winning History of the Scopes Monkey Trial, Summer for the Gods, still, I think, in my opinion, the best work on that trial. He's also authored Franklin and Washington, the Founding Partnership, The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 1789. I don't know where he was in between there. I guess he took a break. A Magnificent Catastrophe, The Tumultuous Election of 1800, America's first presidential campaign. If you think 2016 and 2020 was wild, you should read about the election of 1800. An Empire of Ice, Scott Shackleton and the Heroic Age of Antarctic Science. To the Edges of the Earth, 1909, The Race for the Three Poles and the Climax of the Age of Exploration. And the textbook Evolution, The Remarkable History of a Scientific Theory. Dr. Larson is a university professor of history and Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair in Law at Pepperdine University, my old alma mater. He lives with his family near Los Angeles. Ed, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
What a bio you have. This is incredible. It took me 5 minutes to read it. You've written a lot. Give us a little bit of background before we get into your new book, which I forgot to introduce. Sorry. The American Inheritance. In fact, I'm calling this episode America's Original Sin. Your book is called American Inheritance, Liberty and Slavery in the Birth of a Nation, 1765 to 1795. Thus, the relevance to today's conversation on race and 1619 versus 1776 and all that. We'll get into that a little bit later. What's your background? How'd you get interested in history, particularly American history?
A little bit like you, I started out doing biology, and I did that undergrad. I became fascinated, though, by the history of science, interested in the battling claims of authority that science gradually acquired, didn't have originally, and did that at the University of Wisconsin, and how the law handled that, which ended up me getting a law degree as well to add to the history of science. But that was my question. How the sort of thing you deal with Skeptic. With the Skeptic magazine, of how do we analyze claims of authority? Anybody can say, I've got credibility, I've got authority. Historically, obviously, it was the church or tribal elders or some sort of thing that had authority. Over the last, since the so-called scientific revolution, since the Renaissance, gradually science has cut its teeth as a criterion of authority. But as we all know, as your recent book, Conspiracy, accounts, that's still not the test of authority globally or even in our own country. And it's those questions of epistemology that have always just absolutely fascinated me. And they come out in one way or another in many of my works.
Yeah, just to rip off the headlines of current events, RFK Jr. running for president, and he rants on and on about you can't trust authorities, the peer review system is broken, and vaccine science is not proven, the jury is still out, and on and on and on. And then you ask him about climate change, he goes, oh, the jury's in, the consensus is there, the experts are right. It's like, wait a minute. how can you sort of be so contradictory like that? So I guess everybody has a thing that they're on about, and then they declare the authority or they denounce authority, something like that. On your Scopes book, before we get into the new one, is it your sense that the kind of creationism movement and subsequent intelligent design movement has largely faded away and we're dealing with other culture wars now?
Well, the second part, yes. I think we're now dealing with other culture wars. But that doesn't mean the others faded away. I think there's a strong, you can see it in polls, you can see it other variety of different ways. There's a strong creationism has a strong hold globally, probably growing in Asia, for example. It's very strong in Africa, but it's strong in Latin America, South and Central America, where evangelicalism is exploding in these places. Korea, but in the United States too. Creationism is still strong. Intelligent design is trickier. I don't ever think that was sort of a nuanced version. Sure, it seemed credible and people used it, but I'm never really viewed as intelligent design really had a deep hold on many people. It was more creationism, and then you go right back to your creation accounts, whether they're Christian or otherwise.
Right, and that gets back to that authority and who speaks for truth. Is it your sense too that with the rise of the nuns and the decline of religion as an authority in the empirical world, that they've shifted more toward finding morals and meanings as they are the authority, sort of Gould's non-overlapping magisteria? We get science and they get morality and meaning.
Well, I certainly agree that the so-called rise of the nuns, and how deep and how broad it is, it's certainly an existing phenomena, especially with younger people, with the younger generations, people under 30, and their creationism as a result, because really you believe the Bible first. Let's say if you're Christian, you believe the Bible first and then comes creationism. It's not that, despite the original proponents of the revival of creationism, Henry Morris and others, who would claim we persuade people about creation and then they become Christian, therefore it is the cutting edge of evangelism. It's never worked that way. It works the other way. People accept Christianity or Orthodox Judaism. It works there. It works in it actually works in other religions as well. You become part of that group, and then you see what baggage is carried with it. And it always has struck me it works the other way. And your book, Conspiracy, I think, lays out that path. And therefore, once you believe on a whole variety of honest reasons, a search for meaning, a desire for community, a place where your children can be brought up correctly, a whole variety of reasons, people still go to the church. Not as many as before, according to statistics, and I agree with the statistics strike me as right. But then if you're in an evangelical church in America or certain Jewish churches, other certain Islamic, certainly some Islamic groups and some Hindu, then creationism comes with it. And with creationism, certainly there are people who believe that it's readily reconcilable, that God could use evolution as a tool of creation, a theistic evolution. We see that with Francis Collins and many people, biologists. But that's not the general rule, because people don't, I don't think people have any reason to wonder about how life began. And therefore, if they accept the biblical account in general, well, they accept the biblical account in total. And that doesn't mean they necessarily accept all the violence of the Old Testament. They sort of pick and choose. But Adam and Eve come pretty close to the top of that picking and choosing part.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when I was at Pepperdine, there was no creationism there, as far as I could tell. I was a Christian, and I thought I was supposed to be a creationist, and I got to Pepperdine, and I think nobody was a creationist. I was like, oh, okay, I guess this isn't really part of the package. I don't have to accept creationism. So, that was enlightening. Yeah, and it's almost like the conversation today about UFOs and UAPs and how come the government won't reveal what they really know. Well, one thread is people will lose their minds, and religious people will not be able to accept this because why? But from the polls I've seen, is most religious people say, it wouldn't bother me at all if it turned out to be aliens. God can do whatever he wants. He can go to every planet in the universe.
That's true. And certainly a lot of members of the LDS Church would buy that.
That's right. They each get their own planet. I forgot about that. Okay, America's original sin. I mean, this is an unbelievable topic. Since my wife Jennifer moved here 10 years ago from Germany, just channel surfing the news every night, every day, there's something about race. And it's like, what is with American race? I mean, Germans, they have their issues, but, race isn't really one of them. So this kind of is our founding original sin or whatever. Even that phrase, I first heard it in that HBO series on John Adams, where Abigail Adams says to him, this is America's original sin. I suspect that was the screenwriter's line. But there must have been some sense at that time, like, what are we doing here? We're talking about freedom and liberty, and some of us are enslaving people. So let's start there. What's the bigger picture on, why did you write this book? Is it because this is really an important topic, and let's find out what these people actually believed and why?
Yeah, I think that's a one way of putting it. And to be a little more specific, in my case, I brought out that book you mentioned, Franklin and Washington, which dealt with their relationship. That book came out shortly before the pandemic. Indeed, the closures from the pandemic, it shut down in the middle of my book tour. I'd made about halfway. I was as far as, I think I was in Florida or Georgia at the time, and missed the second half of the book tour. But from that account, I deal with the interrelationships of the long interrelationships between Franklin and Washington, going all the way back to the French and Indian War, the surprisingly intricate and complex. But the last chapter of the book dealt with after Washington became president, after the ratification and first election. And that's when the break between Washington and Franklin on slavery came out. Now, Franklin had already turned on slavery decades before, and he was president of the first abolitionist society in America. George Washington, in contrast, had been urged during the Revolutionary War by, there was an abolition movement during the war, and we can talk about that. And some of his top chief lieutenants, like John Lawrence and Lafayette, tremendously, had really tried to push Washington to abolish slavery, figuring he has a national reputation, and if he will join this movement to abolish slavery, which was taking root during the war, this will really help propel it. But he didn't. And he equivocated, he said wrote some nice letters, but he ended up not doing it. And then by the time he becomes president, he's pretty well comfortable with his with slavery, and is bringing his enslaved aides and servants with him to Philadelphia and New York when he's president, creating a real controversy. Well, Franklin was there in Philadelphia, and Franklin was pushing Congress to limit slavery at a national level. And so they have quite interesting encounters in the last chapter. And it turned out, as I was going around on the book tour, to get to your point of your question, that's what everybody wanted to ask about. Sure, I talked about the French and Indian War, which was all new to most people. They didn't know Franklin and Washington worked closely way back in the 1750s. But they were fascinated by that. And so once I got entrapped at home with the pandemic lockdown, I was going back and forth with my editor, and he just said, look, people are really interested in this. Can you expand on it? And I said, what do you mean? Do you mean expand a whole book on just Washington and Franklin and slavery? And he says, no, the whole picture. Because really, while there are books out, you go all the way back to, while there's certain books about slavery in America, wonderful book about slavery in Virginia in the 1600s by Edmund Morgan, a real classic. And there are other books about pieces of it. Nobody had really unpacked the whole issue in a sort of a comprehensive way of the conflict between slavery and liberty during the Revolutionary period. Even the 1619 project, of course, focuses on 1619. While I pick up the story, certainly I look back, but I pick up the story with the beginning of what's generally agreed as the Revolutionary period, 17, 65 with the Stamp Act crisis. And so I, had a lot of free time on my hands with everything shut down. Tremendous amounts, since I'd had several books on the Revolutionary period and access to all sorts of archival material. I just decided, well, hunker down. I might as well unpack this project. And so it became my COVID project of really tearing in the primary source material. I also, pulled out the secondary, but the primary source material to see actually what people were saying and doing about the twin issues of slavery and liberty during this revolutionary era.
When you're doing that, when you pull out a quote from somebody that sounds ennobling or it sounds awful in hindsight, how do you know how representative that is? As an intellectual historian, I mean, you have to survey a lot to say, well, this is a typical attitude or this is an atypical attitude. How do you parse that?
It's a great question. Now, when I'm first, let me just emphasize that point, is one thing with this topic, everything is documented. Every I is dotted, every J is dotted, every T is crossed. Because, as you know, with your book Conspiracy, as you know from your whole career's work, this is an issue, and there are other issues like that you just really have to document with primary sources and primary analysis. And you can't go back and put our judgment on the past. And I don't think I've done any of our judgment. I certainly point out a lot of people back then, like Abigail Adams, who were very critical then. I think that's fair game. But as for then trying to, once you go back to going to primary sources, well, there is a variety of different ways. First, you got pamphlets. And the Revolutionary period was marked by pamphlet wars. Well, we pretty well know how often those pamphlets were reprinted, how widely they were distributed. And that gives you a pretty good idea of readership and importance. Like there were 3, dominant pamphlets during the original Stamp Act crisis. There were 2 or 3 during the Townshend Act issues. Then you can also, there was newspapers running all the way from, there weren't many in Georgia, but certainly from the Carolinas to New Hampshire. Now, we have wonderful archives where all those are kept. What happens is those newspapers, there were no copyright laws back then, borrowed heavily on each other. So you can tell how often a letter by, say, Samuel Adams was reprinted. Did it just appear once up in Boston, or was it reprinted in 20, 30 newspapers? Well, that shows you a lot about impact. And then you can go with the, there's, wonderful compilations of the letters of, you name them, anywhere from Henry Lawrence to George Washington, from second level revolutionaries to first level. People have authority based on how widely they were known, how widely they were commenting, who they were working with. So if you have a letter from George Washington, he had a lot of influence. And so if we know what he says, or Henry Lawrence had certain influence in certain areas, just to use the 2 examples I've given, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin. You have these Mercy Otis Warren would be a very influential female writer. Of course, Abigail Adams. And then you'd look at any Black who could get published. And there were some. Any Black who could get published. Phyllis Wheatley is, of course, probably the most famous, but Benjamin Banneker, Caesar Sarton, there are a variety of others. So you get some African American voices as well. So that's how I try to give the authority of different ones. And I try to document it by pointing out that this was a widely reprinted letter, or this letter was reprinted in so many newspapers, or this pamphlet was reprinted in 8 colonies and in France and in England. And that way I try to evaluate if it's just some random comment, or is it said by an important, influential person? Is it a comment by the governor of South Carolina, or a British general, or Christopher Gadsden, or somebody else who has a particular influence. And then, of course, you have to the extent you have records of the Constitutional Convention or of the Second Continental Congress or the First Continental Congress or different events, well, then you have the authority that this is an event many people attended. So I try to give a reader, clue into the reader of why this document should be listened to.
Yeah, interesting. Do we have a sense of what the literacy rates were in this period?
Sure, there are various accounts. It was pretty high in the New World, 60% or more. We're talking about 60% more people of the free people. The literacy rate was not very high for enslaved. In fact, in many states, it was against the law to teach enslaved people of how to read or write. That would be fairly common procedure, and certainly maybe everywhere but Massachusetts. As for, though, the literacy rate, we know how widely we have a general sense of newspaper circulation. We know that practically every Middlesex village and town had one or two newspapers. Phenomenal rates. Nothing like this occurred in England. England, the literacy rates then were very low, and very little was published outside of London. In America, people read newspapers. Why? Because they could own land. And since they could own land, and since they had economic opportunity because it was the frontier, there was a purpose to read newspapers, because that included the quite a few publications for things that were be sale. You could market your goods through it, whether there was new land. Newspapers were practical, but they also included news and reported what was the event, and they loved to include letters to the editor or poems written. There were lots of submissions, and then they were readily picked up. So there was pretty remarkable literacy. Now, it was certainly higher in the North, where there was widespread common school movement already, and there were colleges scattered around in the North, and people, even, basically working class people like John Adams attended them. And then you have, of course, people like Benjamin Franklin, who's just an apprentice, an indentured servant, and yet he can read eventually dozens of languages.
Yeah, there's that scene in John Adams where his son, John Quincy, is like 8 years old or something, and he's out in the field, and the son wants to participate, and John says, no, you're going to go to college. I'm doing this so you don't have to do this. You're going to do, and then your generation will produce the poets and the artists and so on. Yeah. There was that kind of a sense of progress through education, I guess. But what you just said surprised me. I always think of the English as the, kind of highbrow literary people, and the Americans as these kind of backwater yokos, but not so.
Well, the British was an upstairs, downstairs society.
Oh, yeah.
Very small percentage of English people could vote. We're talking about less than 10% of English people could vote. And if you can't vote and you have no economic opportunity, you're just going to be what your parents were. And most of people were just worked in, most people in England were just almost serfs. They just worked on the land. And they were basically tied to the manor. They had no right to vote. They had no reason to read. And then, of course, others, this was the beginning of the birth of industrialization. So there were others working in the sweatshops in various places, or they went to sea in the Navy or in merchant marine ships. In contrast, in America, in all these colonies, there was tremendously wide voting rights. Now, only free people could vote, but you have to go from colony to colony. It varied, but in colonies like Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, you had 80% of the free males could vote. And if you could vote, there was another reason why you had to be able to read. Also, in addition to that, not only that, but pamphlets. It was a wide tradition of pamphlets and newspapers being read publicly, either in the public houses or on the public square. So things like Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Not only did I mean, the circulation of that was phenomenal. The number of copies sold. We're talking about equivalent of a third of the population was the circulation. But we also know that it was read. It was read aloud.
So there was also a kind of what we would call social media, I guess, coffee houses and town squares. And this is how they got their info. If they didn't read, somebody else read it and they talked about it.
That's true. That was widespread. And newspapers literally were everywhere. There were these published newspapers. Often they were only 4 pages. So it was one piece of paper printed on 2 sides and then folded. That would be very common. But they would come out once a week or twice a week or 3 times a week. And these were in even small towns.
Astonishing. All right, let me read a section from your book. I'm going to read several sections from the book here because your writing is so beautiful and the original quotes are great. So this is your section on a paragraph on Benjamin Franklin. Whereas his thoughts on race evolved so much that he came to favor the abolition of slavery, Franklin initially espoused an even wider version of Americans than Crèvecoeur, sorry.
The French writer.
The French writer. And here, quoting Franklin, "There's supposed to be now upwards of 1 million English souls in North America," Franklin wrote in a widely reprinted essay first published in 1755. "Why should the Palatine, German, Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them?" Turning from culture to race, he added, "All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, Native Americans exclusive of the newcomers wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are most Germans." Positing that only the British and the Saxon were truly white, Franklin asked, "Why increase," this is the quote that you always see, "why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so fair an opportunity by excluding all blacks and non-native tawnies, of increasing the lovely white and red?" By red, he meant native peoples. Wow. I mean, that's astonishing. Unpack that for us. What was he thinking?
Well, he was thinking, remember, he's in Pennsylvania, and it's mainly a rant against the Germans moving into Pennsylvania, which and remember, the Germans tended to be extremely religious, which he wasn't. And they weren't like the Quakers. They weren't like the Friends around him. They tended to live isolated rather than mingle, and he was a very social person. So it cost him, by the way, that essay cost him the only election in his life he ever lost. He lost a election for the state wouldn't be state, it would be colonial legislature. Because of the reaction against that particular essay. He had always been close with the Native Americans. He was the first person to publish Native American writings, and he had close ties with Native Americans. He thought very highly of their culture, and so he includes the Reds. There weren't many Africans living in Pennsylvania. Weren't too many, and this is a period of transition for Franklin. By the end of the 1750s, he will have personally funded and become a leader in a movement for schools for African Americans. But early on, he had a few enslaved African Americans of his own and had published ads for them. But he had also published, going all the way back to the 1730s, the first publications by abolitionists, Benjamin Lay, for example, several abolitionists in Pennsylvania. He would publish their pamphlets as the Quaker Church, as the Friends Church was slowly turning against slavery. And they had pretty well turned against it by 1750. So this is written in that transitional time. It was a political document. It was a rant against the Germans, but he did throw in German immigration. But he did, as you see, he did throw in Africans. Now, that played at two levels. First, the Quakers had already totally turned against the so-called Atlantic slave trade, which was viewed as horrendous, of capturing individuals, taking them out of their families in Africa, throwing them in these awful slave ships where a sizable percentage would die, bring them over and sell them into enslavement. People all over America had turned, even people who had enslaved people themselves had turned against this. So you're limiting that. Why bring these enslaved Africans in? You're not increasing that number. So it plays at various levels. But it's a polemical document, and it tries to. I try to present these people where they're at, and that's where Franklin was at. It wasn't until the 1770s where he becomes an avowed abolitionist, as opposed to just a supporter of limitation of the immigration of enslaved people. Now you see that. I mean, Jefferson and Washington and many people who continued to own enslaved Africans also turned against the further importation. Now, that cut two ways. First, you didn't have more Africans coming here. But if you're in the business like Washington and Jefferson were, and many Virginians, of selling the children of your enslaved people, well, keeping out any further imports just increases your own market share. And they knew this.
Interesting. Reminds me of the debate in the civil rights era in the 60s between Martin Luther King, let's go slow, legal, progressive that way, versus Malcolm X, let's have a revolution. There must have been something like that, or and many cuts in between. Just stop it altogether, abolish it, or just stop it from growing any further, but let them have what they have now, and that kind of thing.
One thing I like about Franklin during this period, it was actually only about a year after this, he writes this letter. He has funded this, he has contributed money to this school for African Americans in Philadelphia, originally prompted by local Quakers and English Quakers as well. And he's been tapped up for money, and of course he's one of the richest people in the colonies, and he's a amazing public servant, so he gives some money. So he's curious about his school, and he goes there, and he looks at these African American children. He sent some of his children of his own enslaved workers there. He only had like 2 or 3 enslaved workers, but he sent some of his own children of his own enslaved workers there. But there are also free blacks in Pennsylvania, and some of them go. And he goes there and he writes this letter. He says, boy, these kids are just like white kids. They're just, some are smart, some are rowdy, some talk back. They're just like white. There's no difference between this and white kids. And he writes this letter to the founder of the school, and he just writes them. They're just like anybody else. And it is a very wow. You'll never get a letter like that from George Washington, or of course Thomas Jefferson, who writes Notes of Virginia, where he concludes that Africans were a different species of person, and none of them have a modicum of true reason. And you just won't get that for Franklin. Yeah. But then, of course, they had different bracklines. Franklin started as an indentured servant. He fled indentured servitude in Massachusetts, and that's how he ended up in Pennsylvania. Yeah,
interesting. Yeah, I was going to read a passage here from your book on Jefferson. In his 1785 book, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson expressed similar sentiments about race and ethnicity of the American people as Franklin and Otis. Widely quoted, this book presented the new republic as rooted in the concept of liberty, and its creed as, quote, a composition of the freest principles of the English Constitution, with others derived from natural right and natural reason. Much as Franklin had expressed alarm about non-English immigrants disrupting the American experiment in liberty, this is you talking now. So Jefferson worried about the impact of foreigners generally, by which he meant those not raised within the Anglo-American tradition. Now you're quoting Jefferson. Suppose 20 millions of Republican Americans thrown all of a sudden into absolutist France. What would be the condition of that kingdom? He asked. If it would be more turbulent, less happy, less strong, we may believe that the addition of 500,000 foreigners to our present members would produce a similar effect there. So he's worried about, I guess, the kind of unity of the nation, of a kind of cultural people that we want and others we don't want.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that rings just as true today. And that is what really Franklin was focusing on with his rant against the Germans. And you hear it here with Jefferson. That's a constant. You can go back to Puritan Massachusetts in the 1600s. They said the same thing. We don't want other people here. And by other people, they meant other Europeans, or, you can see it with other Europeans, including Spanish or French, German, people with other traditions. And this anti-immigrant nativism is, I mean, it's just, you can look at the America today. This is sort of rhetoric. There is a real concern of how many people who are not accultural to the American democratic experience, how many people the nation can absorb. And now it works against how many Muslims can America absorb. For some, how many people from Central America can absorb. You see it in Europe with how many people Germany can absorb. And that sort of issue, that's different than a racial issue. That is not, that's xenophobia. And that's, fundamental to the American history. You can find that in any period. You look at Warren G. Harding in the 1920s, that's what he was elected on. And they passed the Immigration Restriction Act. You look at the Chinese restriction, the exclusion of Chinese, and the so-called Gentleman's Agreement from the late 1800s. You look at the Know Nothing Party and fighting the immigration of the Irish, and Catholics were viewed as fundamentally, because they were obligated to the Pope. They were fundamentally not compatible with American democracy. So I don't know of any period in American history you won't get comments like that.
Yeah, interesting, right? Because when Angela Merkel opened up the borders to Syrian refugees, then this was the cry. Well, but they're not Westerners. They don't respect women like we do, and so on and so forth. And then that's going to change the fundamental definition of what our nation is. Right. So this nation is not just race and language, it's a whole suite of cultural characteristics. So that goes back to the founding of America itself. These debates were quite active at that time.
Absolutely. And England and America that was played into the Revolution with after the French and Indian War was very important to the rise of the revolutionary spirit in America. And part of it was adding Catholic Quebec and making that a so-called colony under England. And then the Quebec Act, that played into the whole situation. And of course, the reason why we needed a Stamp Act was to raise funds to support the troops to keep the Catholics in Quebec suppressed, partly. Other reasons as well. But Americans were very, you can see Americans wondered about adding Quebec as another province. And so you see this coming, and of course the Spanish coming from the south. You see Florida and places like that, which became a British colony as well as a result of the French and Indian War. So these are issues that played of what was an American, which are different from the idea of slavery. They're related, but they're different.
Well, attitudes towards slavery must have at some level depended on how you look at these other people that are different from you. So since Franklin and Jefferson were both scientists, or what we would call scientists, that wasn't invented till the middle of the 19th century, but they're natural philosophers, I guess. So take us back to the debates at that time of monogism and polygenism. To what extent do people think the blacks came from a completely separate race of people? They're a different species, so they're not like us, versus they're just like a sub-race or a subspecies or something like that?
Well, this issue became critical in America during the Revolution because, Pennsylvania aside, there wasn't much of an abolitionist movement in America before the Revolutionary period. I said, the Friends, there was some movement within the Quaker Church in Pennsylvania. Not enough to abolish slavery in Pennsylvania, but there was some movement before the Revolution among the Quakers. But the Quakers were viewed as a peculiar cult, generally.
Really?
Oh, yes. They were. Well, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts during the colonial period used to hang Quakers. Literally. That's not figuratively. They actually hung Quakers. It was against the rules in Massachusetts during the colonial period. And so they were viewed about like Americans. Some Americans today view Scientology, I suppose. And so they had very little impact on the rest of culture. And they had a powerful position in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, and they had some influence in New Jersey and Rhode Island. But they didn't reach out much. But the Revolutionary War changed everything. The Revolutionary War, liberty was at the heart of why we revolted. You look at most revolutions, it isn't necessarily on this. Most countries are an geographical extent of an ethnicity. The Poland is for the Poles or Thailand is for the Thais. But America, what really pushed it was the Stamp Act crisis, no taxation without representation, and also related that we should not be governed by by a parliament over which we cannot send members. And it wasn't just the taxation, it was other activities as well, like the Quebec Act or the Quartering Act, a variety of things. So Americans were really, I think, genuinely fighting for their conception of liberty. This was a conception that came from, John Locke and Rousseau, this idea that humans are born in nature free and form governments to advance their life, liberty, and property. And since you cannot be governed except by the consent of the governed. This was fundamental in this social compact view that, again, really doesn't go back much before the Enlightenment. And so Americans believed it because they were experiencing it. They had gone off to the New World, unlike in England or in France, where you were serfs if your parents were a serf, or you were a cobbler if your parents were a cobbler. Here, America had opportunity. They had economic freedom. It was a very libertarian place. And when the British tried to limit that after the French and Indian Wars in the 1760s, Americans reacted. So they were, I genuinely believe Americans were fighting for their liberty. But by this time, they'd entrenched chattel slavery in their colonies. Every single colony, by law, allowed chattel slavery, with the southern colonies in New York and, having a pretty intricate system of chattel slavery where anyone was enslaved. All children of an enslaved mother were enslaved, and enslaved people could not, typically, they differed from that. They couldn't assemble, they couldn't own weapons, they couldn't read or write, they couldn't, they were limited in so many ways. Nothing like that existed in Europe. There had not been any slavery in England since the fall of the Roman Empire. So for 1,000 years, slavery had been illegal in England and most of Western Europe. They had serfs, but serf is different. You're tied to the land. You're not in, and you can go to church and you can, learn, you can do a whole bunch of things as a serf. You're not enslaved. You're not property in the same way a dog or a cow or a sheep is property. And that's what had developed uniquely in America, this concept. Sure, there's been a form of slavery all over the world for all time, but not this formalized British system of chattel slavery, which really goes back to the Caribbean, but then is imported from the Barbados Slave Code, the Caribbean, Jamaica, and it's imported during the very late 1600s and early 1700s in America. So how do these two things go together? Fighting for liberty and using the concept, we do not want to be enslaved. Remember, this was the time that the most popular British song was written, that was later became Rule Britannia. Britannia rules, and the closing line is Britons will never, never, never be slaves. And Americans sung that too. That came out in the 1740s and 50s. That was widespread. It was quoted. And Britons did not have. If you were an American, British American, becoming rich, living in South Carolina or Virginia, and you wanted to take your enslaved valet with you to England on a trip, and many English, rich English from South Carolina, Virginia, they went over to Oxford and Cambridge for their education. They would have a home in England. You couldn't take your enslaved with you because the minute they stepped foot in England, that slave was freed. So now the contrast, we're fighting for our liberty. That leads to the famous line. There were many lines like this, but the famous line by the Samuel Johnson, the writer of the dictionary, a very influential Whig essayist in England. He said, when that revolution was building up, he said, I'd have a little more respect for their cries for liberty if they weren't coming from the drivers of slaves or drivers of blacks, I think he said. So the point is what seemed to English to be the hypocrisy, but Americans noted this. So during the Revolutionary period, where every colony, all 13 colonies had slavery before, including pretty high percentages in some northern colonies like New York. During the Revolution, some people, like famously the most important pamphlet of the Stamp Act crisis was James Otis's pamphlet, and he says, we will never be the slaves of Britain. And by paying stamp taxes, we are enslaved. By the same token, we shouldn't have any slaves of our own. We should get rid of slavery. And you see this from more. John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Abigail is caught up in this too. And you see this growing movement. Benjamin Franklin certainly was reinforced at this time as well, even though he'd already turned against slavery before this. So you see this rising tide, so that during the actual war, while the battle was still going on, remember, Yorktown doesn't happen till 1783. 1781, and then the peace treaty 1783. Before Yorktown, Massachusetts abolishes slavery. New Hampshire abolishes slavery. Pennsylvania abolishes slavery. Vermont abolishes slavery. Rhode Island and Connecticut are on the way. New York and New Jersey, it's coming. So there's this abolitionist movement during the war, which is pushed by the revolutionary spirit. One thing about revolutions, they certainly create a lot of pain, but revolutions are also a dynamic time of change where you can actually change established institutions and beliefs. And it happens with that. But the issue is, while there is also abolitionist rumblings in the South, they get quashed, and instead in the South, they double down on slavery, and they view the power to have slaves as part of their white liberty. And so that's when this, you mentioned, I'm finally getting there, you mentioned, before that you see no debate between, are we all children of Adam and Eve? Do we all come from one lineage, or are there separate races? Are Africans a different species? Now, Hume in England was already pushing this line in England, that Africans, and Hume was widely read in America. Well, not widely read, but he was read by people like Jefferson and Franklin and, the educated, the highly educated people, because he was a popular English writer. And he is already pushing this in England, that Africans were, like baboons, or, baboons are a different species, and orangutans are a different species, and apes are, and so are Africans, somewhat closer to that. And that gets picked up as the South during the Revolutionary period is doubling down on slavery. Well, they're confronted with people in the South or North, talking to them, talking to Washington, talking to Henry Lawrence and saying, talking to Jefferson, how can you do this? Well, how can you say that, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights? Many abolitionists are saying you cannot say that and not abolish slavery. As my book, I quote a lot of people who said that. And the result is, well, they're not men. The only way out is they're not men. And so in 1785, right after the Revolution ends, Jefferson writes his famous Notes on Virginia, where he gives this argument, picking up on Hume, that, Africans, I've done a study. I've done a scientific study of Africans, and they can't reason. They're not rational beings. They're not us. And whether it's happened by time or they were originally created this way, they're basically a different species. That becomes his argument. Well, needless to say, the abolitionists in the North and the scientists in the North, like David Rittenhouse, which in Notes of Virginia, Jefferson has picked out David Rittenhouse as America's greatest scientist at the time. Rittenhouse plows back and says, you're totally wrong. We are all one species. And so you get this debate with Rittenhouse and Sam Host Smith from Princeton on one side, Franklin, of course, as well, and Jefferson and a bunch of others on the other side fighting over, trying to, justify the abolition of slavery or justify the continuance. And it gets tied in with this scientific debate over, are all humans one species or are we multiple species?
Yeah, interesting. I'm going to read one of the passages you wrote about David Hume, one of my heroes, but we're all products of our own time, I guess. By this time, some American supporters of slavery had begun to make the case for enslaving blacks on supposedly scientific grounds, often drawn in the arguments of Scottish philosopher David Hume. I am apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general all other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even an individual eminent either in action or speculation. Wow, Hume wrote in a comment appended in 1753-54 to his xenophobic essay on nationality traits. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction betwixt these breeds of men. Holy moly. It's like, dang.
It's
the great rationalist. Yeah, okay.
It's tough to figure this person had much knowledge of Chinese civilization or Inca civilization, or I could go on and on.
It's a little bit like Rousseau and Hobbes arguing about the true state of nature before civilization. How would they know? Nobody knew anything about archaeology or anything like that. They're just talking through their hats, right? Just kind of, navel-gazing thought experiments about what life was like. Yeah. Okay, so you just solved another question I had on the Quakers, because I've always wondered if the Quakers were so effective at arguing for abolition using the Bible, let's say, why didn't they convince their fellow Christians? Well, I think you answered the question. They looked at the Quakers as like just a crazy cult. And so why should we take their argument seriously? Something like that?
And the Quakers did not realize, well, part of the reason they were viewed as a cult is the Quakers back then, presume now too, but back then, they didn't rely exclusively on the Bible. They, of course, had direct messages. They were sort of like charismatics are today. They had directly messages from God, feelings, and they would get up in church, of course, men and women. They didn't have formal preachers. They had anybody could get up with a message from God. And a lot of these arguments that they had weren't necessarily structured strictly on the Bible, but often by these, they were, if you look at Benjamin Layer, the other original Quakers who turned, or John Woolman, who turned against slavery, it often comes from a general sense of this radical equality. They believed in a radical equality, and there were no kings and there were no serfs. We were all equal, and that sense of equality. Now, it had biblical roots, and certainly they would look for biblical justifications, but it's really hard to go to the Bible to condemn slavery, because the Bible, as the book notes, by the end, by the 1790s, when the South is reacting very defensively, they're quoting the Bible just as readily as Northerners in support of slavery.
Interesting, right. Okay, another passage here from James Otis, one of your characters you develop in the book. In an introductory section on natural rights, Otis now acknowledged the relevance of his argument to the institution of slavery, which still flourished in Massachusetts. The colonists are, by the law of nature, freeborn, and indeed all men are, white or black. Will short curled hair like wool instead of Christian hair? What a weird turn of phrase, Christian hair. Okay. Otis asked in a series of queries pointing past superficial racial differences, can any logical inferences in favor of slavery be drawn from a flat nose? Turning on the Caribbean sugar islanders who accepted the Sugar Act because it raised the price of sugar in America of sugar from other sources, he added, it is a clear truth that those who every day barter away other men's liberties will soon care little for their own. That's an interesting argument. Indeed, Otis warned, for a little present gain, these Creole planters, as he called them, would make white as well as black worse slaves if possible. So here we're starting to get to a kind of a rational argument for why slavery is wrong.
Yeah. And I think most of the arguments during the Revolutionary period, or many of the arguments were rational arguments, because just as the Revolutionary period is a time for change and led to, really, the Revolutionary era America was the first great emancipation of enslaved blacks in the history of the world. Both the British were freeing the enslaved people of patriots, and in the North, slavery was being abolished. But most of this is actually pushed on a rational basis, because the Revolutionary period also marked a tremendous breakdown of religion. This was a more secular age than the America had ever exhibited before. And you can look at the founding fathers, and most of them gave up whatever religiosity they had had before. For example, before the Revolution, George Washington at least attended church, and he had chairs, he had seat boxes in 2 different Anglican churches. He served on the vestry. During the Revolutionary War, he stopped going to church, and he dropped off the vestry, and he rejected the divinity of Christ. How much he accepted before, I don't know, but he rejected it. So that even when he was president and he thought he should go to church as a symbol of sort of civic religion, he always very carefully, as the bishop in Philadelphia would note, he always left before communion because he couldn't take communion, because he couldn't accept that was the body and blood of Christ. But you don't limit that. You go right down the list. John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin. Providential theist would be a good name for him, maybe deist, but more providential theist. They believed in a creator God, typically. Some, like Gouverneur Morris, was probably truly an atheist. But this was not a religious period. And so arguments based on the Bible just didn't have that much effect until the Second Great Awakening returns America to the church.
When was that?
Oh, that would be 1820s.
Right. And the First Great Awakening?
The First Great Awakening had pretty well died down. The First Great Awakening was 1750s. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and people like this. But in the Revolutionary period, religion dwindles, and there's a rationalism, of course, in some, the rise of Unitarianism, conversion of congregational churches in New England to Unitarian churches. But there tends to be a breakdown of religion in general, and then it builds back in the early 1800s, and then becomes the norm by the middle of the 1800s.
Interesting. Yeah, you said, slavery had not been practiced in England for 1,000 years. So would it have never developed as a practice without the colonies and without the economic structure to support it?
Probably so. If you're tracing historically the movement, the only slavery that existed in Western Europe. I'm not an expert on Russia. I don't know. Russia, it was serfs, whatever you want to call it, or Eastern Europe. But in Western Europe, there was a legacy of slavery in southern Italy and the islands, that are in the Mediterranean, southern the northern Caribbean, Mediterranean coast, because Islamic people in North Africa would enslave Christians. They'd come over, and Christians would go over and enslave North Africans. And so there was a little bit there. And what happens is that when Portugal is trying to reach China by going around Africa, they loop around the Islamic areas, North Africa, and make it down to sub-Saharan Africa, where a form of slavery is practiced. And they find and expand sugar production in some of the islands off the African coast, because sugar is like white gold. It was the most valuable crop. And then when Portugal, because the Pope drew the line wrong, dividing Spanish and Portuguese, ends up Brazil. They run into Brazil, which sticks across the line, and they start sugar colonies in Brazil. And so they import sugar technology from the African coast, and they import enslaved black workers to Brazil. And so African chattel slavery of some sort starts and expands in Brazil, and then the Portuguese carry it to the Caribbean, because the European countries that are competing with Spain, because Spain, of course, has taken most of the rest of the Mexico and South America, and major islands like Hispaniola and Cuba, and at first as pirate bases, the French and the British and the Dutch take these little islands in the Caribbean and use them to raid the gold ships carrying the gold back and the silver back to Spain. But gradually, sugar plantations are incorporated in there, and sugar technology is brought up, stolen in some cases, from Brazil. And so in Barbados, in Jamaica, in some French colonies like Martinique, some Dutch colonies in the Caribbean, they start growing sugar. And sugar is a brutal crop to produce. And to produce it, you can't keep free white people doing it. So they bring in enslaved blacks. And remember, the very first enslaved people brought to Virginia, they came on a Portuguese, if you remember from 1619 project, they came on a Portuguese slave ship carried to near Jamestown, and they carried in and sold in Jamestown. And so the English in the mid 1600s devised this chattel slave code, the Barbados Slave Code in Barbados. And that then, South Carolina was, after the Restoration, was given to some English lords, because it was sort of on the borderland with Spanish Florida. And these lords try to develop a cash crop. And they know the really rich, by far the richest colonies, they weren't Massachusetts or New York. They were Barbados, they were Jamaica. These things were churning out money for France, Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti. These things were turning out money. They were making England and France as rich as the gold from Mexico and Peru were making Spain. And so they wanted to have a plantation crop in South Carolina. They finally found it in rice, which in the swamps and marshes of South Carolina and the brutal heat and the malaria is as brutal a crop as sugar. And so this was mostly settled by the small from Barbados, the small white landowners who were being pushed off of their land with the growth of large sugar plantations. And so the Carolinians, the proprietors of Carolina, went down and recruited them, and they came up, and the original Constitution for the Carolinas, written by John Locke, none other than Life, Liberty, or Property. John Locke, he was the secretary for the colonies. The original Constitution says that every white was entitled to have his enslaved blacks, and actually using race. And these were Barbadians who came up with their enslaved blacks and started the rice colony of South Carolina, which became, per capita, the richest colony in the English colony on the mainland. And so that's where the chattel slave code from Barbados comes to South Carolina. And only then, after it's entrenched in South Carolina in the late 1600s, is it adopted in Virginia in the first decade of the 1700s, and then then later in Georgia, later in Maryland, later in the other southern states. So it is imported into America, not from England. It's imported from other British colonies, other American colonies. There's the root. The root's in Barbados and Brazil, not in England and Spain and France.
And what was their intellectual tradition to abolish slavery? 1809, I think, was the first abolition law in England. And you often hear Anglicans and Wilberforce, and there you hear the religious influence on the abolitionist movement versus rational arguments.
Well, what they were doing, there was no slavery in England, and so if you brought over your enslaved person, they were immediately freed. It was at first a movement. What Wilberforce fought for was the ending of the African slave trade. And certainly it was religious for some, but it was also rational for others. Pitt was not particularly religious. Others picked it up, that this was brutal and inhuman to send, there were British slave catching colonies in what's now Sierra Leone, the Bunch Island slave factory, as it were, where and they wanted to shut this down because they were seeing both rationalists but also religious people, evangelicals. Certainly, you would call Wilberforce some sort of an evangelical, and evangelicals got tied up with this in England, Quakers too, and the brutality of capturing a person, pulling a child from their family, and throwing them on these brutal ships, something they'd never seen before, throwing them in a hold where there wasn't enough water, was no air, where they were packed together, literally like sardines, dying in vast numbers. Chained so they wouldn't jump overboard and kill themselves. The picture of that. And so the English wanted to stop that African slave trade. Now, that didn't mean that there was a movement to stop it. Now, that didn't mean they wanted to abolish slavery in the colonies. The enslaved people were already there. At first, there was no abolitionist movement in the sense we want to end it there. Those people had already been brought over. It's to end the African slave trade. Now, many Britain traders, merchants, made a lot of money on this slave trade by the 1700s. And of course, they didn't want it stopped, so it was a real battle. That's where it started. Only later in the 1800s does it shift to be, let's abolish slavery in the British colonies. It wasn't in England. It's abolishing it in the British colonies. And that comes up, and similar in France after the revolution in France, there's a movement to abolish slavery in the colonies. And they end up, the Dutch have a similar movement. Eventually the Portuguese have some sort of a similar movement. But we're not talking about slavery at home. We're talking about slavery overseas.
I'm going to read a little bit from Stephen Hopkins, who you also quote, Rhode Island governor, merchant, and slave ship owner, and Secretary of Maryland, London-trained barrister, and slave plantation owner Daniel Dulaney, employed slavery merely as a trope to assail taxation without representation. While modern readers cannot read the word without thinking of Africans in chains, Hopkins, Dulaney, and others like them ostensibly had something else in mind. Hopkins opened his pamphlet by declaring liberty is the greatest blessing that men can enjoy, and slavery the heaviest curse that human nature is capable of. Without mentioning physical bondage, he then explained, those who are governed at the will of another or of others, and whose property may be taken from them by taxes or otherwise without their own consent and against their will, are in the miserable condition of slaves. There he's talking about whites who are enslaved to England through taxes or something like that, I guess. Right, so they're kind of nudging up against abolition in their own indirect way there.
Well, they're not necessarily nudging up against abolition. What they're using is a metaphor, is a trope, it's great politics. And the three biggest pamphlets, the most influential, most widely republished, most widely quoted colonial pamphlets against the Stamp Act were Otis's, which you've read for before, and the one by Hopkins, one by Dulaney. Those were far and away the three biggest ones for if you look at number of republications or times they're quoted. And all of them use this slavery trope. Now, that had already existed in Whig writings in England going back to the 1600s, where they in sort of a form where there was no slavery, remember, where they talked about the Hanoverian kings they're talking about the Georges are trying to enslave us. They were basically the pro-parliament faction, and these German kings are trying to enslave us. And but in America, it really was effective, and you can see how it spreads, because in America, in the English colonies in America, no matter where you were, whether you were in Boston or whether you were in Charleston, you could see chattel slavery. You could see people being sold at auction. You could see them being ripped from their families. You could see them being beaten. You knew of them for being raped and forced into sexual acts. I mean, this was common and ever present. And so if you use this Whig trope and sharpened it by then not only by talking about chains and talking about whips and talking about being raped, and it was a powerful way to articulate, to capture people's minds of what the Stamp Act meant. Now, obviously, when we read them today, you sit there and roll your eyes, because these people will say, what we are suffering. Here is Dulaney writing, who owns, fields of enslaved workers, or John Dickinson from England later with the Townshend Acts with his Letters from an American Farmer, who owns hundreds of enslaved workers. And they're talking about them being in chains themselves and us suffering. We are suffering the worst form of enslavement known to humans. And you're sitting there going, well, wait a minute, they're enslaving a lot of black people, and I think that's worse than what they're suffering. But the message worked, whether you were being read by a person who owned enslaved people, or whether it was being read by a person who didn't but saw it. It had a tremendous power and force, and therefore, virtually, best I could tell, all the Patriot writers picked it up. So a person who was opposed to slavery like Franklin would use it. People who had enslaved workers like Washington would use it. John Adams repeatedly would say, who had never owned an enslaved person himself, though he didn't do much to push the end of slavery. And when he ran for president, his running mate was the single largest slave holder in the the Americas, Pinckney. He would repeatedly say in his letters, published letters, as well as private letters, "We won't be Parliament's Negroes." Just what he'd say. Now, if it was Patrick Henry, he wouldn't use as nice a word as Negroes. But they were all using it, and they were all talking about changing whips. And Samuel Adams, who didn't own any enslaved people and was opposed to slavery, or John Hancock, who was opposed to slavery, they were all using this because it was an effective metaphor, because Americans, they saw what was around them. They saw the state of true chattel slavery, and here they get the president of Harvard or Dickinson or Adams or any one of them saying, what you're suffering is the worst possible form of slavery. That had effect, and it helped. I mean, you've got to somehow inspire the American people. Once you decide you want to fight for liberty and then independence, you got to inspire people to follow. And remember, only about, a third or maybe 40% of the American people, we don't know exactly, they didn't have polls then, but were actively supporters of the independence movement. You had to rally that cause, and this was rhetoric that worked.
So the majority of Americans, very likely, were fine with being colonies of Great Britain.
Well, I think,
or not fine, but they not enough to want to burn the thing down and start over.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, the general rule of thumb, and I don't know how people come up with this, but the general rule of thumb is that there's a third of the people wanted independence, a third of the people were Tories, and a third of the people were, like the Quakers, were sort of straddling the fence somewhere in between. And how much those numbers work, I might bump it up to 40% were actively seeking independence by the end. But it wasn't there were a lot of loyalists, and there were lots of fence straddlers.
Another common theme here is that to stitch together these 13 disparate colonies into one United States, the Northerners who were against slavery had to compromise and just let the slave-owning colonies come in. That's just the way it goes. So that's how we end up with the Constitution we had. It's called compromise. Is that true?
I would think that's fair. I think, but that by the time the Constitutional Convention met, which is, the Revolution had been over for 5 years, the states had pretty well, under the Articles of Confederation, pretty much established their own ways. And the northern states had either abolished slavery or moving into that way. They had pushed for the Northwest Ordinance, which means that the Ohio country, what became Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, there could be no slavery in those territories. Meanwhile, the southern states had doubled down on slavery and were pushing it into Kentucky, Tennessee, eventually into Alabama, Mississippi. And that was basically half and half. And so when they got to the Constitutional Convention, I'm not convinced that either side, because they lived in their own worlds, either side knew just how passionate the other side was. I think the Northerners who were all moving toward abolition and rejecting slavery didn't fully appreciate how committed the Southerners were to slavery. And I think the Southerners, they remembered the time before the Revolution. There wasn't a lot of communication. I do not think they were fully aware of how committed, how opposed the Northerners were to slavery. And so when they all got together in Philadelphia, it dawns on them, not initially, but gradually I see it developing, and I try to chronicle this, that they realize that we're really a house divided. And so James Madison repeatedly, but in his own notes of the convention where he recounts his own speeches, he tells people, and he says this more than once, he said, I used to think we were divided on whether we were an urban state or a rural state, whether we were an agricultural state or an industrializing state, were we a big state or a little state, Delaware versus Pennsylvania. But no, the only division that matters is whether we're a free state or a slave state. And that is what is, as Gouverneur Morris said at the convention, that's going to lead to a civil war. That's what's tearing us apart. And this document will never be ratified in the South if it's an anti-slavery document. And it will never be ratified in the North if it's a pro-slavery document. And so what they do is they gradually realize, and you can see the Constitution evolve. It wasn't in the original Virginia plan, gave Congress total power over anything that seemed of national impact, anything. And it used proportional representation, and the president would be elected by Congress. And then they come to realize we've got a fundamental division here. And if we give Congress the power, total power over national issues, they'll abolish slavery if there's a majority Northerner. And so a whole variety of compromises are worked out of how you could craft a document. And we're living in the shadow of that. Craft a document that would forever enshrine state-sanctioned, by state I mean individual state, not federal government, state-sanctioned slavery or state-sanctioned non-slavery. That is, so they come up with enumerated powers. So the government only has certain enumerated powers, and none of them touch slavery. So they come up with the 3/5 compromise, which the math of it works out that if you give 3/5 of a person for every enslaved black, that you have the best they could determine, and they were dead on. They were pretty good about these things. You would have an equal number of representatives from northern free states as representatives from southern slave states. They knew they were going to have the Senate equal because they knew as soon as it was over, as soon as they had the Constitution, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee were coming in. So that was going to be 8 and 8. So if you have 2 representatives each, you're going to have a divide there. You're going to have a divide in the House. And then they extend the 3/5 compromise. They come up with the Electoral College because originally president's going to be picked by Congress, which would give Congress the power to do that. And then Franklin is pushing for direct election, as are the Northerners, because they know the South won't let the enslaved people vote. The North, in some northern states like New Jersey, women could vote. So you had a lot more votes in the North. And everybody was basically, there were very low property rights in the North. They were very high in the South. So if you use the Electoral College, you can suppress the heck out of the vote in your state, and you still get the same number of electoral votes. So you don't have to let immigrants vote. You don't have to let women vote. You don't have to let non-property voters vote. And so with that extended to the presidency, both the presidency would be equally balanced and Congress would be equally balanced. And then you had enumerated powers, that you only had enumerated powers. And as the Southern representatives who took us back and spoke at Virginia or South Carolina or North Carolina or Georgia, well, we don't have Georgia records, but North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, they said, they can't touch slavery because it's not in the enumerated powers. Well, that lives on because now that we have a movement in the Supreme Court to originalism, what is your enumerated powers are limited. So does it include abortion? Does it include contraceptives? Does it include gay marriage? They weren't thinking that way. The enumerated powers are what the founding fathers, the reason they went to Philadelphia, people like Washington and Franklin and the others who went there, Wilson, Sherman from Connecticut, all these states, what they really cared about was a commercial union. They wanted like an European Union, a common market. They didn't want trade barriers between states. Before the Constitution, every state had its own economy and they could put up trade barriers. They had their own money. They had, there was no common trade. And so they wanted a national market economy. They wanted the federal government to be able to tax and spend for the common good, so they could, because before that, the Continental Confederation Congress couldn't raise taxes, so they could have a military, so they could open the frontier. They wanted to go west. Franklin and Washington and Jefferson, they were all big believers in Western expansion. Well, you couldn't have Western expansion unless you had a national army, because no state would do it. And they also had to defend the trade, shipping against privateers and against the British and the French. So they wanted a national market economy. They wanted national control over interstate and international commerce. They wanted an army so they could defend the country and push west. This is what they all agreed on. So they got a constitution. That's what's in the enumerated powers. No state can print money. Only the national government can coin currency. You can't affect contracts. You can't those sorts of things. So this is a commercial and military union, but it's not, as opposed to before that, there was no effective central government. There was literally a league of friendship. That's what the actual terms in the Articles of Confederation. So they got what they wanted, and if you go back to originalism, and depending on the weight you give the 14th Amendment, it opens up. So we're living now. Those battles were fought over slavery. All those things, the Electoral College, they come about because of slavery, and protecting slavery in the South and protecting no slaves in the North. That's why the Civil War didn't happen until the Dred Scott decision by Tawney breaks this deal. When Tawney rules in the Dred Scott decision that Congress cannot limit anybody from taking their enslaved people wherever they want in America. Before that, you couldn't take, a Southerner could not take their enslaved people and then move and live in Ohio. Well, what happens to Dred Scott was about Dred Scott, an enslaved person, being taken by his owner, Sanford, to Illinois, and then to the Free Territory of Minnesota. And Dred Scott saying, I should be free. I was taken to Illinois, and I was taken to, I'm not a runaway slave. I went there. And that, you remember back when this whole started, what had happened in England when an American colonist with an enslaved person, like Charles Stuart living in Virginia, carried his enslaved person, in that case it was Somerset, to England. He was declared free by Lord Mansfield, about as conservative a jurist as you can imagine. He was declared free because he was voluntarily brought here. When Justice Tawney broke the deal that was the foundation of the compromise by saying, no, you can bring your enslaved people into another state, that's when Lincoln goes out of, he was just a lawyer. He hadn't been in Congress for years. That's when he said, wait, he runs for Senate on the argument, we have to overthrow the power of the Supreme Court, this regime, because we could go together. His famous line in this House Divided speech, we in Illinois could go to sleep dreaming that slavery is on its way out in Missouri and the South, and we wake up in the morning realizing that not only in Minnesota, but in Illinois too, the power of the Supreme Court is going to make slavery everywhere. So they broke the compromise that was implicit in the Constitution, and therefore Lincoln says a house divided cannot stand. And so what they had done in Philadelphia was create that house divided on this incredibly divisive and emotional issue. And
amazing.
So it all lives today.
Yeah, no kidding. Ed, I could listen to you all day. It sort of feels like they all knew this Civil War was going to come eventually, but we just kick the can down the road and hope the future generations figure this out. Because otherwise, we're not going to be able to accomplish anything now.
And they truly believed in a free market economy. They believed in a national market economy. They believed in the importance of interstate and free interstate and federal government controlling this. And so, yeah, Washington, you can see Franklin, he wants to abolish slavery. He's president of the Abolitionist Society of Pennsylvania, and they gave him things that they wanted him to raise. And he said, he basically decided, if I raise these at the Constitutional Convention, I'll raise them as soon as it's over, which he does. As soon as Congress meets, he raises them. But if I raise them here, we'll never get a document through. And so it is a compromised convention, but it pulls together a document that lasts for, until the Civil War and is still sort of bumping along, but we feel its effects. And I think that's one of the things as we struggle with understanding the impact of recent Supreme Court decisions. We have to think back where they come from.
Right, all the way back to this compromise necessity. All right, so had the Dred Scott decision not happened, how much longer could the can have been kicked down the road? Would we have a civil war? And while I'm on that, without the cotton gin, would slavery have died economically eventually? Economists have debated this. It would have been dead by the end of the 19th century on its own without a war.
Well, I must admit I'm a historian, not a prophet, and so I don't know for sure. My general sense is slavery was fully entrenched in the American South and fundamental to the Southern economy and way of life before the cotton gin. So I personally don't think. The cotton gin certainly increased its value, but I think it would have continued. I think it was integral before that. As for the Dred Scott decision, certainly it would have gone longer. Certainly, I have no doubt that the Constitution would have lasted longer without the Dred Scott decision. How much longer? I don't really know, because would something else have eventually touched off? Was this too profound a difference? We see the battles in America now between the states defending abortion and passing more protective laws about abortion, and the states limiting or totally abolishing abortion. If the Supreme Court overturns the decision for same-sex marriage, we're going to see the exact same split happening on same-sex marriage, with states banning it and other states permitting it. So we see these divisions, but are they leading? Certainly a few people like Marjorie Taylor Greene begin speculating about splitting the country up, but are they enough to split it up? I don't think so, but it does provide clear divides. And I think as long as the Northerners could have been confident that slavery was limited to the South, then South was confident that they were safe with slavery in their territory. I think simply self-interest, that Civil War was brutal. I think self-interest would have kept the compromise going for longer. How long? I'm not sure, but longer.
Yeah. All right, let's kind of wrap it up here with talking about Lincoln in your last chapter. I wrote about Lincoln in the moral arc a little bit. I love his quote, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. And then I write here, in an unpublished note penned in 1854, Lincoln outlined the argument in what to our modern ears sounds like a perfect articulation of a behavioral game analysis. In his refutation of the arguments made in his day that the races should be ranked by skin color, intellect, and interest, by which Lincoln meant economic interest, Lincoln wrote the following: if A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say, well, A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker? Take care, by this rule you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. You do not mean color exactly, you mean the whites are intellectually the superiors of the blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. take care again, by this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But you say it is a question of interest, and if you can make it to your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. I mean, this is the perfect embodiment of the principle of interchangeable perspectives. How would you feel?
Franklin wrote similar things. And
He
Lincoln, I mean, both were rationalists. Both faced the consequences of their thinking and carried them to logical, not extreme, but logical conclusions. James Otis was the same way. That sort of thinking begins being common in the Revolutionary era, and it expands. And your quote from Lincoln is simply brilliant. That is Lincoln at his heart.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, I like this from your book here. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Boy, that's putting it on the line. I mean, that's what the war was about.
And that's what the Dred Scott decision was about. That's what Taney was. Taney was a Southern judge, and he was trying to force the issue because he knew it was, we'd already had bleeding Kansas. We already had the divisions were growing, and he just wanted to settle it in one fell swoop by the Supreme Court. And, sometimes I think this Supreme Court or the last, I'm not trying to defend the Warren Court here. The Warren Court tried to settle things, and this current court, the same way. I think we've got activist judges now. We had activist judges then, and they're trying to settle that what are really social, cultural, in some cases religious, in some cases fundamental issues by court decrees. And, nobody elected those judges.
Right. Yes, it's good to keep that in mind with these current debates on the Supreme Court. I mean, they are smart people. I mean, I have great respect for the Supreme Court, but, they're not deities. These are not prophets channeling God's words, right?
and they have goals and results, which they do want. They want to. I don't know if they want to be God, but they certainly want to weigh in and resolve these matters. And they have opinions, and it's just like some people could never accept, some right to life people could never accept Roe versus Wade. It came from an unelected court. I don't know if they would have accepted if it was done by a legislature either, but that you can put aside. And the same thing is happening today, and the same thing happened in Taney's day, and at least with the constitutional compromises, as vile as some sound today, they were fully debated and ratified. And I spend a chapter talking about the struggle the states had. And the biggest struggle in every ratification debates to which we have complete access, and that's more than half of them. That's most of them. There were minute by minute records. Slavery was the biggest issue. It doesn't matter whether it's Massachusetts or New Hampshire or Virginia or South Carolina. Slavery was the biggest issue then. And it's interesting how important slavery was to both sides.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're still dealing with the issue. I have no idea what it's going to take to right this wrong. Maybe it's another century. I don't know. I mean, when you read the literature of like systemic racism, the deeper kind that's economic and long-term, generational wealth differences, property ownership, income inequality, that sort of thing. Even if there wasn't a single racist left in America, and it is at an all-time low, but there's always going to be, some non-zero percentage of people that are racist. But let's say there was none, there's still going to be these big differences, as I understand it, because of these, centuries-long differences in property ownership and inherited wealth, and just the kind of structure that you see with, real estate and loans and, just sort of baked into the system, that it seems like everything you wrote about, we're still dealing with a lot of this. And short of reparations, and that seems pretty messy too, to right the wrong. It could be we're going to be dealing with this for a long time to come.
Well, but I mean, we had I cover what happens during the Revolutionary period, where half the states abolished slavery, and yet there was a retrenchment. So that by the time of the Civil War, there were only 2 states that allowed black people to vote, even free black people. Only 2 states allowed Connecticut, blacks couldn't vote. And you had states like Illinois and Oregon where you could not be black. You could not live in the state if you were black. So there was a lot of that effects, and the ongoing effects, well, that's what Martin Luther King wrote about in his great book, Why We Can't Wait. He said, well, you declare everybody free and you end segregation, you end the Jim Crow laws. But if you're having a race and you're forcing some of the people in the race to start it's a 100-yard dash, and some of them have to start 100 yards behind, no matter how fast they are, they can't catch up. And so that's the ongoing effects. But yet, you do have some, as anyone could point out, there are some black people and many black people in America who have caught up economically. So if you just divided everything based on race and didn't factor in where they are in the race now, to some people that seems profoundly unfair. So I agree with you. What this means. Harold Holzer, that great Lincoln historian, probably the best Lincoln biographer around and has won the Lincoln Prize, he happened to review my book for the Wall Street Journal. And it's a very intricate and complex review. I recommend it to people. But his final line, it's very, very friendly. He goes over my various arguments. And in the end, his last line is something to the effect is, well, now we know what happened. It's up to us to decide what to do about it. And that's true. I'm not a political scientist. I wasn't giving policy arguments. I was simply trying to lay out as best as I could as a historian, fairly to describe what had happened during this period from 1765 to 1795. And if we can at least start you're a rationalist. I try to be rational. If we understand what happened then, it gives us a base and we agree on it. And this was in the Wall Street Journal, their feature review for that week. Then maybe it's only if we can agree on the facts that then we can decide, factoring in all the policy issues, of how we proceed. But if we can't agree on the past, we can't hope to agree on the future. So I would agree with Holzer. Well, this is what happened. Now it's up to us to decide what to do about it.
There's your next book.
That one's beyond me.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I don't know. All right, Ed, I could listen to you all day. As I said, this is an amazing story, and you're so knowledgeable. It's astonishing how much you know about this stuff. But it's time to go, so I'm going to sign off there, say thank you for coming on the show. And one last question. What are you working on? What's your next big project?
Well, I'm still back in this period. You know me, I did the Scopus trial. I've done history of the theory of evolution. I want to get back to history of science, and I will try to do that next. But I have one more work where I'm trying to unpack. I got fascinated by the rhetoric of revolutionary rhetoric in slavery and liberty. Now I'm going to look more at the writings of Paine, the writings of some other writings, to see how to work more. Because, whenever I do a project, I have a pile of what I use, and I have an even bigger pile of what I don't use. So I'm trying to work through some of that with my next book. And I hope to have that out maybe by, what are we looking for? About 250th anniversary coming up. So I'm going to try to have one more book out, but I'm also piling up stuff to go on with history of evolutionary thought and history of biology and more on Darwin, and because I love that world too.
Nice. I like that. Yeah, this is one way I convince myself to keep my books reasonably short, is by cutting material and telling myself this will be for my next book, because otherwise it's too painful. But I love what I wrote there. Well, just use it in another book. Oh, okay.
That's my plan.
All right. Sounds good.